Welcome to a brand new podcast. Iain McLean is a writer and the author of TJ's War. David Blair is an actor and the narrator of the audiobook TJ's War. David and Iain have been listening to their readers and listeners and have decided to turn TJ's War into a movie. And since the story covers the entirety of World War II, the movie will cost at least $50 million. Will David and Iain succeed in their quest? Follow them in this podcast series. We're going to make a $50 million movie.
All right. Well, welcome to another edition of We're Going to Make a $50 Million Movie. Our guest today is Robert Kreitlein, and he is an astute movie buff and historian whose keen eye for detail and deep well of knowledge about World War II and its cinematic portrayals are unparalleled. I'm stating, I'm claiming his insights into film that both glorify and horrify this tumultuous period are profound and thought-provoking. Welcome to the podcast, Rob Kline.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Rob, we kind of had you on because you haven't read the book. You haven't had a chance to yet. I'm sure you will. This is Iain can tell you in better, more concise detail the gist of the story. It is a war story, a love story. It's about his father. What we want to make here and what we're going to make here is a big budget movie or series that is an anti-war war movie. Iain, do you want to add something to that before we dive in with questions for Rob?
Okay. I'll give you a very brief synopsis of the story. The man in question, Thomas John McLean, was born in 1921. At the age of 18, he went to university, was immediately called up as Hitler invaded Poland the day after he arrived, pretty much. He ended up in Norway as part of the British Expeditionary Force. A lot of them went to France, but his unit went up to Norway to stop the Germans getting nickel from the north of Norway for their armored steel manufacture. And they got their backsides kicked. But Thomas John McLean, TJ got a lot of fieldcraft skills because he was born in the West Coast in the Highlands of Scotland and had learned under the tutelage of his grandfather how to survive in the mountains. So he managed to get his unit back off the mountains to a Free Norwegian Army outpost, where he explained to the man in charge, who just happened to be General Ruge, the man in charge of the whole Free Norwegian Army, how many tanks of the enemy he'd come across, how many troop numbers, and what direction they were going in, and what locations they were in, as he'd come back off the mountains over the last 2 days. Ruge gave him a letter saying, if you manage to get back to Scotland, give this to your commanding officer. And the letter said, promote this man and put him into military intelligence. And that's what happened. And he then spent the rest of the war working behind enemy lines, other countries such as America. So that's the outline. But it's also about the decline of a very, very good man through the experiences he went through during that very intense 1939 to 45 period. And possibly beyond that. The truth is that I don't really know exactly what he got up to, even though he was in MI6 right through until 1959. I've only ever been able to get to the guts of his story up until about 1948, and that's what TJ's War is about.
I mean, I'm hooked already. That sounds fascinating to me.
With all that said, Iain, how do you? I don't know if we've really discussed. How do you envision the war aspect of TJ's War being portrayed? How much war is in TJ's War?
Before I answer that, what's your background, Rob? I mean, are you ex-military?
No, I was going in the Marines out of high school, but I injured my knee. And in college, I found my way to security contracting.
Right.
So I worked for a private contractor in the Washington, D.C. area in the States. And then I later went to the former Yugoslavia And we had a contract to protect war crimes investigators as they were investigating some of the war crimes there in Bosnia and Serbia in that area. And then I did some other stuff kind of related with that. And then beyond that, I'm just a student of history and a film buff.
Well, I think we're all film buffs, but I'm going to take. Mark tells me that you know a hell of a lot about films. So we're going to dig into that. I could tell from first because Mark knows you and I don't. So I'm meeting you for the first time, and I'm hearing your voice, and just your voice and your demeanor tells me that you've seen some things and done some stuff.
Yes.
That's what I want this film to capture. I don't particularly want to see the violence, because the violence is a given, and I don't think the violence changes very much from the Second World War to the Vietnam War to Falklands War and the rest. It's much more about the effect that has on the people who don't actually die, and not just the combatants who've been trained, because I'm also military. It's the whole shebang. It's the combatants' families. It's the civilians in the field who are caught up in all of this through no fault of their own, on all sides. Not just that, but the chaos that comes with war. I mean, Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face. Well, it's a bit like that, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The chaos that comes with that, and the people having to think on their feet when there's an enormous amount of mental stress going on. And that's, the deeper the war gets, the further back that stress goes. So by the middle of the war, Churchill is sitting in his bunker and he's drinking Lord knows how many glasses of whiskey a day. And I really don't know what Franklin D was doing, but I should think he's under a hell of a lot of stress too by the middle of the war. And so there's chaos at home, never mind out on the field. So these are the things that I believe TJ's War, the book, captures, and I want the film stroke TV series to portray that as well. That's what I feel is, it's not missing. There are things, for example, 12 O'Clock High with Gregory Peck, that focuses on the mental strain of being in command, and the decisions that are made and not made because of that. So I think there are lots of war films out there and anti-war films out there that have already covered some of this, but this is not just another one. This I feel is a story that is told from the front line and just an ordinary man. And Thomas John McClane was just another man. This is just one person's story, and I believe that if we went at this level of detail with people who went through the Second World War, because it was an incredible generation of people, there are many stories like that out there. And really, I wrote this story for my children because they've had no experience of that. And I never want them to. And I want them to know why I never want them to have that kind of experience. And I think that if we can really force this message home about the chaos and about the nonsense around these political figures who make these decisions that put us into these positions, it's my attempt at world peace. That's what I'm trying to hammer home with.
Yeah, I think Rob made a good point at the beginning that about, well, okay, World War II is a little bit more difficult because it is not just arguably, it's almost unquestionably a just war in that what we were fighting against. And I know that you don't want to make a political statement with the movie. War just might be necessary sometimes, but the fact remains what the consequences are, what happens to the people who are involved. I don't know, Rob, can you think of like movies that portray that without the how can cinematography and visual elements be used to underscore the horrors of war without explosions or without a lot of arms getting blown off and stuff?
I mean, I think you can get around sort of the morality of World War II in particular by zooming down to ground level. A lot of movies, Band of Brothers comes to mind. Saving Private Ryan is also, like, even though it's about this one unit, even if it's just a platoon, very often very, very well where that fits into the overall grand scheme. And so I think, sometimes you can portray kind of the things that come to mind to me that are the most horrifying about combat is the randomness. Very often it's not the guys on the ground aren't aware, like they frequently are in movies, of like where the enemy is and then where they need to go per se. And so very often you're hearing bullets come at you. You're trying to fire back at vaguely the direction you think they're coming in. And in the meantime, stuff's blowing up. There's things coming at you and hitting you, and so it's that confusion and that chaos. And then often how it just sort of kind of happens out of the blue when you least expect it, that you might have people running around out in the open and they're not getting hit, but then you have somebody who has taken really good cover somewhere and they just get hit with a lucky shot. And it's that randomness that is sort of terrifying about it, that there's a helplessness that maybe there's not much you can do in order to kind of get yourself through it, that you just kind of have to, and I think you can do that by zooming down to ground level and not necessarily showing the viewer everything else that's going on. You give them just a very microcosm of, the battlefield and what this one individual is seeing coming at them and happening around them. It's visceral, I think, much more so than if you kind of know what everything is going on.
Yeah, I think that's actually critical. We can talk about Saving Private Ryan, a movie that's 2.5 hours long, and like almost immediately to me, it is just this 2 seconds of this movie that comes to my mind when they're making the landing and the amphibious the back end of the boat's dropping so that they can get on land, and then just gunfire, and like you could be standing next to a guy and boom, a bullet just went through his helmet.
One of the things that I do kind of have a little bit of a background in psychology, and one of the key factors of PTSD is how voluntary the event was. And this is also why, if you look at the rates of PTSD in military units, the more experienced, the more training, kind of the higher level of training that soldiers get, the less likely they are to get PTSD. So you rarely see PTSD, for instance, in special operations personnel, SEALs, Delta, Rangers. You don't see very high rates of PTSD. Where you do are frequently the kind of the support personnel who are pressed into service to convoy a bunch of supplies somewhere, and then they get ambushed. And so, getting into a firefight or being shelled for them wasn't necessarily something they were really expecting. And so you expect a very high rate of PTSD there, whereas somebody who is voluntarily going behind enemy lines and is expecting it's going to get hairy, it's going to get bad, that kind of situation, they're a little bit more immune to it, I think, because it's voluntary and they are prepared for it a little bit better. Doesn't mean they can't get it. It just means that, they're likely to kind of, have it at a much lower rate.
Or they hold out for longer.
Yeah.
Because we're in the UK, I'm not sure what the US is like, but in the UK, we've reduced our military force massively over the last 40 years. And so now where we have special forces, they're put out in the field and basically there's no one to replace them. So they're just out there and out there and out there. And the best of the best, it's still going to affect them if they're kept out there long enough. And we have a massive problem with that.
Movie, I don't know if y'all have seen it, called The Outpost. It's based in Afghanistan. It's based off of Jake Tapper's book, The Outpost, and it's about
The CNN guy?
yes,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
He was actually, did some of that in embedded journalism in Afghanistan.
I see.
And he was there. And there's a story about Combat Outpost Keating, which was a little military base that was built at the bottom of mountains in the Kamdesh province of Afghanistan. The book does a very good job of detailing the folly of putting this there, that it was just stupid. You don't have the high ground. You're basically on a road, and the insurgents can just fire down at this place whenever they want to. And it's very difficult for the Americans to fight back. Unit after unit that goes there keeps telling everybody, this is an indefensible place. We should not be here. But the higher ups have been focused on Iraq. And so they're trying to do everything with less in Afghanistan. And these guys end up just being sort of, tossed there and almost forgotten. And at some point they end up getting overrun. And the battle that ensues is like, I think there's a stat that more combat decorations came out of that one battle than like anything else post Vietnam, kind of, or maybe even World War II. But that sense of, like you were talking about, Saving Private Ryan and Black Hawk Down, of just being overwhelmed. You've been put into an impossible situation. And that in itself is an anti-war message.
It's when I became useless to the U.S. military. Like I came up in a family. My biological father was in the Army. My maternal grandfather was in the Army. His father was in the Army. Army, the military has been in my family, and I grew up with it glorified in my mind. I even in law school applied to be a Navy JAG in the JAG Corps and the Air Force. I just happened to come out at a very competitive time and didn't make. But my point, I digress. My point is, I've been very pro-military. I became useless to the military when I saw Black Hawk Down, and I just realized, like, in a sudden flash, like, I want no part of being in a war ever in my life. Like, not only just the terrifying moment itself, but even if I survive, I don't even want to live with that memory in my head.
That's a very healthy thought, Mark.
Well, it took Black Hawk Down to get me there, and I might have been smoking.
Why did you go out to? You didn't say Bosnia. You said
the former Yugoslavia.
Kosovo?
Which, so that
Kosovo you went to? Yeah. What as a civilian made you think that was a good idea?
Well, my boss, this was in the 90s, mid 90s, and in the US at least, military contracting, security contracting was the new wave. After the Gulf War in the early 90s, and we had Democratic administration, they were drawing down the military, like you were talking about, with the UK, they were reducing the force size. And so military private contractors kind of came in to fill in that gap and do things. And so, I was working, we did transport security in the US, escorting trucks that were carrying nuclear material. And then when it came up that ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, was going to be investigating war crimes, the State Department of Defense put out a call for private security to kind of help with that, because the military units that were in Bosnia were already allocated to doing other things. And so my boss sent me over with the first group as a project manager to procure equipment and vehicles. And our job was to just drive the investigators around to various towns, and they would interview people, take pictures, go to sites of mass graves. The Civil War at that point was kind of off and on. There were things that would happen occasionally. Our biggest fear day to day was coming across checkpoints in our travels, because you never knew who was who. That was always, to me, that uncertainty, because sometimes people were in uniforms, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they, might be in a uniform that doesn't represent who they really are,
Oh, really? Right.
and sometimes they wanted to do you harm. Trying to balance I want to protect, the person that I'm here to protect, and I want to protect myself, but I also don't want to do anything that's going to get me arrested, or get me charged with a crime if I, shoot the wrong person or something. And I think to me, a lot of times that's something that in World War II, and this may apply to TJ very specifically, working behind the lines, I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize you don't always know who the enemy is, and you don't always know even the people that purport to be your friends, and I know this was true in World War II with the resistance. The Germans were constantly picking around the edges of resistance groups, trying to turn people and get information. And so that might be something that I think needs to be probably portrayed to illustrate to the viewer, because in a lot of ways, that's probably more damaging psychologically than just being shot at.
Sure.
Like, I've been shot at, and it was, it happened, it was over very quickly, and it was terrifying, but like, you come out of it and you're like, okay. But I noticed that it was that lingering kind of tension about the not knowing. This was in the mid 90s to late 90s. I came back and went to law school, and I did not ever experience any kind of real PTSD or anything for years and years and years, until the early 20 teens. A movie came out called Sicario, about the drug war in Mexico. And there's a scene where they are trying to get across the border carrying a drug kingpin, and they're inching forward in traffic, but they know that somebody's about to hit them, and they're looking around trying to. And something about watching that movie, I was sitting in a movie theater watching it, and it absolutely triggered me. The tension of just sitting in that car and worried about what's going to happen next. It absolutely just got to me. And it had been years and years and years, and I never thought that any of that would come back, but something about just the psychology of it. And that's probably something that TJ experienced, being behind enemy lines, not knowing who to trust, not knowing who's who. And I think, there are ways to kind of build a scene like that. And that example in Sicario is a great example. And I think if y'all haven't seen the World War II miniseries Masters of the Air on there's a couple of episodes where the guys get shot down, and the French resistance is trying to get them out of back to England. There's some very tense moments where they're trying to navigate the resistance. And I think that kind of thing might be a way to kind of get across the tension and the things that he experienced without even necessarily having to get into combat.
The one that springs to mind, there was a number of those, but the one that springs to mind is the Italian Resistenza was the team that TJ worked with most closely. In that respect, well, the Norwegians as well, but the issue with the Italians was they really needed Mussolini to fall before they could establish themselves, and the Catholic Church was instrumental in establishing the Italian Resistenza right throughout Italy. In 1943, TJ worked very closely with an Italian priest some miles behind Anzio, and the Italian priest decided to hold a mass high in the hills, a secret mass high in the hills, to recruit people into the Resistenza. And he knew in doing that there was a very good chance that there would be some spies of the enemy at that meeting. There were literally hundreds around this hill. And there was a discussion between TJ and the priest around this. And the priest said, well, I'm a man of God. God will either look after me or he'll take me in. And that was his view in doing that. A very brave man. And he survived, fortunately. But there was a tremendous fear, especially TJ at that point was back from it slightly, watching what was going on. But he was very worried about the priest. getting caught up at that point.
We have about 5 minutes left. I want to ask a question. I want to go back to Iain for a moment, and then Rob, get your take on. And I don't know if there's an answer to this, but Iain, what remedies do you want the movie? You know, so many World War II movies just show the horrors or the problem of the Holocaust and the horrors of war, and you know, it's a terrible thing. What do you want the viewer to get in the end as like, okay, this is a problem? Or, you know, Rob, you're talking about the indefensible position in Afghanistan, and you know, what I mean, that just made me think, well, how can we fix that? What's the fix that's embedded in the film? What should we take away that, like, we want this change in the world or in life? You know, what do you see as a remedy? Iain and Rob, do any movies do that?
Okay, so Churchill was from 1933 onwards. Churchill was shouting from the rooftops to anybody that would listen. He was based in the UK, but he was sending a sort of letter to America once a week or once a month with a recording saying, "There's a guy called Hitler in Germany, and he's building up an army. How is that possible after the First World War and after the end of the First World War, where we all agreed that Germany should not be able to have an army, navy, or air force? How is this possible that this man has been allowed to do that?" And the issue we really have is that if we've got to the war, then the politicians have failed, and the politicians are voted for by us. So we as a society have failed because we don't do the right thing. As ordinary citizens, we're not engaged, and we don't care about really what's going on in the world. And we don't care that we've allowed people to rape Russia after the fall of the wall. So oligarchs were able to just create themselves through taking the oil, and with massive amounts of riches, put hooligans and thugs into power. And so we've allowed this situation to happen. And, you know, America, after the end of the Second World War and for many years after that, were regarded as the world's policeman. But that's fallen by the wayside, because what's happened along the way is that money took over and oil took over. And instead of going in there for a just fight, it became more about making sure America's interests were best served rather than the world's interests. We've lost our way. The civilized West, what we won at the end of the Second World War, we've given away. We've given away the high ground, and we need to get that back. And we need to be engaged as a society and stop things before they happen, before they start. That's what we need to do. Once we've got to war, we're too late.
What are your closing thoughts on that, or any other movies we might look to after this?
I mean, I think that's, you know, all of that's dead on accurate. The remedy is, you know, to aim up as a society. I think as Iain was kind of alluding to, you know, as far as movies go, the one that most obviously comes to mind is probably Deer Hunter, insofar as, like, you know, kind of an anti-war message based on, look, this is what we did to many of our citizens for a very questionable aim. And that's part of the problem with World War II, is that there was a very good aim there, you know? So, I mean, it's hard to say that wasn't worth it at the end of the day. But again, that's only if you're judging it based on where you know, the fact that once the war had started, then we had to do that.
Well, yeah. And even if it is a just war, I mean, and I would say that it was, there's still the after effects we still have to deal with. I mean, there are young boys who go off fighting this war and are affected for the rest of their lives. Fellas, we're gonna have to leave it at that. Maybe it's good to leave a cliffhanger. Maybe TJ's War should end with a cliffhanger as well. So.
Rob, it's been a real pleasure meeting you. I'm so glad Mark put us in touch.
Yeah, it's great meeting you. I loved hearing about the story, and I can't wait to read the book.
Thanks, guys. Till next time.
To find out more about the book, visit tjswar.com, and to buy it, click on the Amazon link below. To accompany us on our journey, please subscribe to this podcast, because we're going to make a $50 million movie.